Hi everybody, my name is Debbie Lamb from Locality and I'll be your main presenter for this evening. Steve, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, I'm Steve Thomas. I'm the Member Pioneer Manager for East of England, North and East London. I'm here as Debbie's glamorous assistant just to pick up any specific questions around the Member Pioneer programme and to sort of help Debbie with putting the context around the community assets transfer discussion we're going to have this evening.
So, yeah, what I'm going to do tonight is give you a bit of an overview about community asset transfer. I do quite a lot of community asset transfer work, but I'm not necessarily an expert on everything. So if you raise any questions I can't answer, we will get back to you with answers. I think there's two main elements to what I'll talk about tonight. One is very specifically about the process of community asset transfer, but there's also quite a lot of general information about communities taking over land and buildings. So hopefully that'll be useful to you as pioneers, whether or not you're involved in a specific community asset transfer. I'm going to try and stop talking after every 2 or 3 slides so that Steve can have a look at the question box in case there are any questions of clarification, so that I can give a bit more information before moving on. And we'll have a bit of time to answer questions at the end. I hope that's going to be okay. I thought it'd be useful to just give you a quick overview of about Locality. We're a national charity. We have staff based across across England, and we have sister organisations in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. We believe in the power of community to create a fairer society. What we do is to provide specialist advice and support for organisations which are setting up community businesses and which are looking to take on community assets. We provide opportunities for peer learning and networking so that groups and individuals can learn from each other. We provide resources to help people to create change within their communities, and we campaign to get a better operating environment for community organisations. Now, right. This is interesting because my slides are not going forward at the moment. So apologies, folks. I'm going to have to escape and go into doing it on a different methodology. Oh, I don't know what has happened here. Is this going to work? Is that taking a quote? Ah, whoopee. Wonderful. So the Locality network, we have about 600 members, and they create services that meet community needs and spaces where everyone belongs. And services by our members are used by about 400 people every day. I guess as an opener, yeah.
Debbie, can I just interrupt you? Sorry, I'm not seeing your slides on screen at the moment. I don't know when anybody else is actually. I don't know whether there's been a.
Is that better?
Yes, that's good for me.
Good, excellent. Sorry about that technical glitch. I think we've worked it out now. I guess what I wanted to start off by saying is the community of ownership is nothing new. It's been happening for years. Community organisations, community businesses, charities have been owning land, owning buildings, managing them successfully for many years. There are lots of routes into community ownership, and the one we're going to talk about in more detail tonight is community asset transfer. There is also nominating a building as an asset of community value, which was brought in through the Localism Act. That's a separate way of acquiring community buildings and community land. If people want a bit more information about that at the end, very happy to give you some more information. Please just put a request into the question box. Lots of community organisations have bought buildings, refurbished buildings, you're just using grant funding, like the National Lottery. And actually, quite a lot of community organisations have just bought their building. They may be based in a shop or in an office block, been paying rent. And when they've thought about it, instead of paying rent, why not buy it? It could be cheaper. So there are lots of routes into which people, community organisations have got into community ownership. I think it's quite useful to think about why community ownership. When you're perhaps advising community organisations or working with them to think about taking on land or buildings, I think it can be quite useful to explore their motives. One of the main motives is generally as a base for local services, activities for local people to meet. Another motivation is pride of place. You may have a building which is underused, which is derelict, and local communities want that building brought back into use, as it can detract from the neighbourhood, can feel awful. And there is a real cost of doing nothing, as buildings and land can get more derelict, more overgrown, and can feel as if people don't care about the local area. Another thing which community ownership can build is community empowerment. It builds people's skills. They can be on the management committee, they can run the building, they can learn about finance, they can learn about governance, they can learn about fundraising. And also the community brought together in that organisation has a real stake in the community because they actually own something. It's theirs. Community ownership can improve the financial sustainability of a community organisation because they can earn income if it's a building, so potentially room hire, letting out on long lets, running events, getting contracts to run services. All of those are typical things that people do in community buildings. And finally, it can generate local wealth and keep it there. For many of our members who own community buildings, they will employ local people. They will buy things from local suppliers. The local people who work there then buy things from local shops. So it does generate and keep that wealth within the local community. I think I'm going to stop there in case there are any questions, Steve.
Nothing so far. No, you're fine, Debbie.
Fab. So community asset transfer is a very specific form of transfer of assets, property and land from a local authority to a community organisation. I'm primarily going to be talking about the situation within England and Wales because they have very similar setup. In Scotland, there is far more emphasis on community right to bid to buy assets because that's actually quite a strong piece of legislation in Scotland and has been used a lot, and there is some funding available to support that. In Northern Ireland, the thinking has been less developed. There's a lot of pressure for Northern Ireland to develop some of the mechanisms around community asset transfer and to encourage local authorities to get involved. but at the moment there isn't a devolved government, so that's not moving forward. So community asset transfer is the transfer of the freehold or leasehold of a piece of land or a building. In practice, most community asset transfers are the transfer of a leasehold, not the freehold. That would generally be a long leasehold, 25 years plus. In many cases, that would be 99 years or 999 years. And in the case, generally, the community organisation taking the transfer is expected to insure the property. And in the case of a building, in most cases, they're expected to do all of the repairs and refurbishment. Community asset transfer is a transfer at less than market value. Now, that can range from a small discount, so the local authority saying, we recognise the social value of what we do and we're going to give you 20% off the market value, to a transfer at nil cost. The community organisation must demonstrate social value. So that is benefits to the community, why it's a good thing that it should be transferred. The transfer needs to be a not-for-private profit organisation, and it needs to be asset locked. And asset locked means that if the asset is transferred to the not-for-profit organisation, that not-for-profit organisation cannot then sell it and distribute the profits to its members. Community asset transfer is in theory from any statutory organisation. In practice, it's generally from local authorities. It is not set out in legislation. There's been strong endorsement from government of all complexions, Conservative, Labour, Coalition, and strong endorsement from the two devolved governments. In England and Wales, there is a power to transfer, and that's called the general disposal consent. And that allows a local authority to transfer a building or land at a discount or worth, if they're not charging anything, less than 2 million, without getting permission from the Secretary of State. So basically, it allows them to do a transfer if they think it's a good thing. They don't have to get permission from anyone. In general, statutory organisations, if they dispose of assets, are expected to dispose of them for what is known as best consideration. So they're expected to get the market value for them. In case of community asset transfer, they don't have to get market value, provided that you can show, provided that the community organisation is able to show there is real social value coming from it. Some local authorities just do not do community asset transfer, and that is their choice. There is nothing you can do to oblige them to do it. If you're working with someone in an area where the local authority is basically saying, just don't do it, then it's not the end of the story. You can keep lobbying. That group can keep talking to their local councillors, to the officers, making the case. But clearly it's a longer process than it would be if the council is open to it and used to it and ready for it. It's a negotiated process. So councils decide what they want to offer and on what terms, and the community organisation that you're supporting would also be making their proposals to the local authority for taking a community asset transfer of a particular building or land. I think one of the most useful things you can do is to check the council website for their published policy. Most local authorities which do community asset transfer have published a policy which does set out quite a lot of information. And a typical community asset transfer policy will set out who are the eligible organisations. Now, some organisations will already be eligible because of their legal status. Usually, organisations will need to be a community benefit society, a company limited by guarantee, or a charitable incorporated organisation, because that limits the liability of members. It means that if things go wrong and the members of the organisation have acted prudently, then they're only liable for £1 or £5, something like that. It also means that the organisation can hold property in its own right. It's an incorporated organisation. A typical community asset transfer policy will also tell you which properties are covered. Some local authorities will say every property that we own, apart from the ones we're actually using at the moment, could potentially be subject to an asset transfer. Other local authorities will actually say we transfer community centres, everything else is a commercial property, and we're not interested in doing transfers of other properties. Again, if you want a property that's not one of those covered in the community asset transfer policy, it's not the end of the world. You can start to make the case, but again, it's a much longer process. Community asset transfer is usually in 3 stages. There's an initial approach. There would normally be an email address for someone to contact, and the organisation you're supporting, people in the local community would come together and say who they are. And at this stage, you can be an unincorporated group, you can just be a set of community activists making an approach. They would need to say which bit of building or land they actually want, and roughly what they want to do with it, so that the local authority can see that there is some community value. The next stage is an expression of interest, and that takes things deeper. It starts to ask for a lot more information about the group and about the things that they want to do. If you get through the expression of interest, local authorities will then usually want a full application, which includes a business plan, financial projections, and so on. The policy will set out the assessment process. Quite often within a community asset transfer policy, they will actually tell you the questions they want you to answer, and will tell you the kind of scoring mechanisms behind it. So a lot score out of 25, so you get 5 if it's a poor answer, 10 if it's slightly better, and 25 is absolutely brilliant. Local authorities will usually give feedback at each stage, and that'll be more detailed as you go through from initial approach, expression of interest, and full application. At the expression of interest, at the initial approach stage, the local authority might just say, we're not interested in transferring that building. That might be it. You can always ask further questions, you can always enter into a dialogue, but you wouldn't expect to get a lot of information. If you were turned down at full application stage, you'd expect to get a fair amount of information about what was wrong. Some community asset transfer policies are competitive, which means that if the group that you're working with puts in for a building, then the local authority would then advertise it to see if any other community organisations are interested. There are clearly drawbacks to that. It does mean that you could do quite a lot of work without actually securing the building. And the people that you're working with need to realise what the problems might be. Quite a lot of local authorities run a kind of hybrid policy where if there's a community organisation which has been running a building and managing a building for a long time, but hasn't actually had a leasehold or has had a short leasehold on it, quite often they will offer them the chance to take it over without it being competitive. But if they turn around and go, no, actually, we've had enough, we don't want to do it, then the building would be advertised on the website to see who wants to take that building on. So it is important to think about the implications of it being competitive.
Debbie, can I just ask? There's a couple of questions that come through. If I can just take a
Absolutely.
pause there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Pete has asked, does the local authority need to identify the asset as an asset that can be transferred? I think you touched on this in one of your slides. Did you just want to recap?
Yep. Clearly the property or land needs to be in the ownership of the local authority. There are other things that you can do if it's a piece of land or building which you think should be in community ownership and it's not in the ownership of the local authority, but I'm not going to go into that at this moment. It needs to be a piece of land or a building which is in the ownership of the local authority. The local authority within their community asset transfer policy may say, we are only interested in transferring community centres and sports centres, for example. If you are looking at but that doesn't stop you from that doesn't stop you from making a proposal to them for another piece of land or building that they own. It just means that you may have to fight quite hard to get them to consider it, and they're under no obligation to actually accept an application.
Lovely.
Does that answer the question?
I think it does. And also, Anne has asked a question. Obviously, a lot of council websites are quite large and detailed with many different sections. I mean, where would one start looking for the policy around asset transfers on a council website?
I usually go to the search button in which is on the home page and type in community asset transfer.
Great. Okay. Does it
On
normally
most
sit within a
occasions,
particular department?
if they have a department which is broadly communities, then yes. But many local authorities, it's incorporated into neighbourhood management or leisure or something like that. So not necessarily. But I find Googling is usually the way. I'm just using the
Okay.
search button.
Brilliant. We've had a question come in from Paul as well. And Paul wants to know, is there a minimum size of land for which you would make an application?
No. I think a lot of it depends on what you want to do with it. It would need to be appropriate to the how you want to use it. But I don't think there's any minimum. As I say, this is not a statutory it's not set out in law. It's a negotiated process with the local authority. So if you were looking at maybe a small patch for a community garden or something like that, then there's no there's no minimum.
Okay, lovely. And I'm going to be a bit cheeky because I just had two questions I jotted down here as well. You were talking about other statutory organisations that might have assets for disposal. I mean, I'm assuming something like the NHS would be one of those, would it?
The NHS would be in in a lot of areas, another key one, which proves a bit impenetrable, is the Ministry of Defence.
Right.
Who may have very large land holdings in particular areas. And as our defence forces become smaller, they don't need as many bases. And so communities look at those areas and see the potential for community asset transfer. But it is hard work.
Great. And I suppose my other question I had, you were talking about the types of organisations that councils would consider transferring assets to, and you mentioned BenComs and the like. Would things like community interest companies or even co-ops be appropriate for that if it was sort of based on an area rather than a retail co-op, obviously?
Yeah, community interest companies would be fine. The co-ops would be fine. I think they'd prefer community benefit rather than worker co-ops. Because
Okay, thank you.
in general, you need to show there's community buy-in, and it's easier for local authorities to transfer to something where the community can be members.
Great, thanks for that.
Shall I carry on, Steve?
Yeah, yes, please.
Okay, now I thought what I wanted to do with this section was think through the kinds of questions you might be asking and trying to get people you're supporting to think about. And I wanted to go through some of the elements. The first one, we started talking about this, is governance. They will need a suitable legal structure, but that is solvable. There's lots of information about legal structures out there. Co-ops UK publish a guide. We publish a guide. So it's not difficult to do. It's just a slightly convoluted process, but that's not a problem. I think the kind of things you're probably trying to ask with community organisations that you may be working with and who may be thinking about taking on a building or land is the mix of skills on the board of the people who are going to take this on. Skills can be gained. You don't have to be an architect, you don't have to be a surveyor, you don't have to be a lawyer, and you don't really have to have access to any of those, because when you need it, you can buy in some specialist advice. But you need to have people who are going to have enough information and enough time and a willingness to learn things so that there are enough people to actually run the building or manage the land. The other thing is community involvement. And generally, it is good for groups of activists who are thinking it would be great to get a building because we could do this and we could do that, to be thinking about reaching out to the wider community, because in the long term, that's where their customers are going to be. That's where the people who are going to use the building are going to come from. And also where the board, the initial set of people who set it going, is going to be refreshed from. I think it's really useful to ask your set of activists who want to take on a building or so on, why? What do they want to do? Why do they want to take the building on? It's quite interesting that, in my experience, people can get very hung up and very, very committed to a particular building without really thinking through in the long term how that building is going to be used. And the uses of the building takes you on to financial sustainability. Now, buildings earn money, or you can earn money through buildings to keep them going. So many community buildings will charge for room hire. They may well have offices or workshops which can be let out to local businesses or other local community or voluntary groups for rent. They may organise events. That can be anything from sort of car boot sales through to, some of our members are quite high-class wedding venues and charge a fortune for doing it. But the money that they earn through doing that then cross-subsidises all the other work that they do. When you're thinking about land, it's potentially more difficult to see where income comes from. You may be able to hold events on land, you may grow things, but it's possibly a little more difficult to see where the financial sustainability comes from. I think it's useful right at the start, if you're working with people, to think about what the drawbacks are with the land or the building. That doesn't mean that you don't try to take it on and to refurbish it, or to take on a piece of land to produce a garden, but it is useful to know and to have them at the front of your mind. So I think there are several different things in this. I mean, drawbacks of buildings may be that they're in the wrong place. Lovely building in the wrong place. It may come across some, one where the local authority was very keen to transfer a building, which would have been brilliant, except that it was within a very large amount of unlit parkland. And terribly difficult to see that anyone from the community was going to be comfortable going there in the evenings when it was dark. So it may be in the wrong place. It may be right on a main road and you feel that it's too exposed. Or it may be ideal because it's on a main road. It depends on what you want to do. There may be issues which come up around the kind of layout of the building. Now, if the layout isn't right for what the group wants to do with it, that may be a minor or a major problem. It might be a few £100 to stick up some stud walls, or it may be just kind of gutting the building and rebuilding the inside so it actually meets what you need. And other drawbacks which are solvable but at a cost are things like if it's got a serious amount of asbestos, if it has got a heating system which is shot, if the roof is in a mess. All of these are drawbacks, and it can help to balance against the enthusiasm for going for a particular building. I think the other thing to make people aware of is the time scale around community asset transfer. It does take time. In my experience, somewhere between 18 months and 3 years. I know that you're sitting there thinking that sounds absurd, but by the time you've been through a 3-stage process, and and the community organisation has the time to do the work it needs to get incorporated, if it needs to do that, to develop business plans, financial projections, and by the time the local authority assesses what's been presented to it and it gets through its committee stages, it does take quite a lot of time. So it is worth considering making people aware of that, because it's unlikely that they're going to get a building through community asset transfer in 3 months. Feasibility and funding. Now, it's useful to think about feasibility and really if you're working with a group, trying to get them to consider all the options, because you may be looking for the transfer of just a building. The local authority may be saying to you, well, we might consider the building, but we actually want you to take the land around it. The local authority may be saying to you, we don't want to transfer that building to you, but we would consider a transfer of another building. For many community organisations as well, it may be that owning a building is not the best option. That comes back to the discussion about what you want to do in the building. If it is around a specific activity, it may be easier to just rent rooms from another community organisation. And so looking at all the options and making a framework so that people can make a decision with their heads, not their hearts. And it is important to think about what you might need funding for. You might need funding to buy the land or the building. If the local authority is offering a discount, then if they're offering a 20% discount, then you're going to have to raise 80% of the purchase price. That's a key consideration. If you do get the building or the land, what's it going to cost to refurbish, repair, make the land what you want it to be? How will they cover the costs while they get started? I think the other key issue when thinking about the kinds of costs and feasibility is when you're thinking, even on the back of an envelope with a group, about where the income for running a building might come from and what the costs might be. If you're looking at needing to raise grant funding on an ongoing basis to keep the building open or to manage the land, then I think that's one that people need to think very, very carefully about. Grant funding has become much more difficult to acquire over the last 10 years. And in particular, getting funding for running costs is one of the most difficult things. You're up against a huge amount of competition because there's been a lot of community asset transfer of community hubs, community centres, leisure centres, and so on. So it is much more difficult to get that. And the community group that you're working with needs to think about that. So let's see if I can. I think the community organisation that you're working with does need to think quite hard about developing a business plan. And that's probably right from the early stage when they might be thinking of putting in an expression of interest. And the business plan should cover capital. That's the money that you might need to buy or refurbish. And revenue, that's looking at the ongoing income and costs to keep the building open or to keep the land operating. A business plan is usually a requirement of a full application, but the group should be doing it for themselves. It is really important that community organisations that you're working with don't do a business plan because the local authority thinks they ought to. It's really to help them to understand exactly what they're taking on and to be fully on top of it before they make the commitment. I've talked a little bit about income, room hire, managed workspace, events, activities. Expenditure, how much is it going to cost to run? Utilities, rates, though you may be able to get rate relief, water, licenses, staffing, and so on. One thing I do see, just a couple of tips here. One is don't confuse need with market. I'll give you my favourite example of the moment. I haven't put my webcam on, so you can't see me. But if you did, you'd probably be sitting there saying, there's a woman who needs to go to the gym. I've advised a lot of community gyms over the years, and a lot of people devise their community gym for people like me. However, I'm not going to the gym. And I'm not going to pay you in order to go to the gym. So the market, especially when you first open, is people who like exercise, not people who need it. So it's really important that the community organisation makes that distinction because their income is going to depend on people who are going to be prepared to pay for the room hire, who are going to be prepared to pay for nursery services, who are going to be prepared to pay for gym services, and all of the other things that they want to do in the building. It's also important that they consider competitors and potential partners. There's certainly, I'm based in the northeast of England, and there's certainly a couple of places that I could name with 3 community buildings within 50 yards of each other. Now, at that point in time, if they're all community asset transferred and they're all looking to sell room hire and managed workspace to the same audience, they're likely to have a problem. So it is about looking at who else in the area is doing what you want to do. It's also important to look at potential partners. There may be many community organisations out there, and actually, as pioneers, you may, some of the community groups you're working with, you may be able to link them up with community buildings who need people to come in, pay them some rent for renting the rooms, so that you increase their sustainability and also allow the community groups to operate well. So finding potential partners, finding community organisations which maybe want to rent, for a couple of days a week or something like that, then that can be brilliant. It can bring in some really stable income. You may be able to do that with a local authority who may want to run maybe a group for people with disabilities or so on, or for older people, and on a couple of days a week, and will pay on a regular basis for doing that. So it is important to think about who are the competitors and who are the potential partners. I think that's a suitable time to stop again, Steve, and see if there are any other questions.
Okay, I'm just checking to see if anyone's sent anything in. If anyone does want to sort of submit a question, it's a great opportunity to do so. Debbie, I just wanted to pick up on something you said around governance, and it's something I'm really conscious of, where you said you need to sort of show community involvement. I'm always aware that some of these projects can start out with very small groups of people that aren't necessarily fully representative of the broader community, and I suppose what you'd advise is to reach out to as many different sort of people within the community as possible to demonstrate real community interest and involvement in this?
Absolutely. Successful community buildings and land, if what you're doing is a community garden or something like that, work well when there's a broad support from across the community. You can do it through a whole range of things, and both online and offline. So events can be a great way of doing things, making contacts, actually talking to people in the community, going along to things that are happening in the community, having a stall at fun days and things like that can be great to let people know what the small group are planning. These things are generally run by a relatively small group of people. And that's no problem. It's really ensuring that there's buy-in, and also that the group are doing what broadly the community wants. Because if they aren't, they just won't have any customers. And they won't have people who come in to refresh the core group of people when the core group of people after 10 or 20 years decide they've had enough and they'd really like to walk away from it. And we come across some community organisations where each year when there are vacancies, there's there's a contest for who gets to be on the committee. You can go to the other extreme of 4 or 5 people who had their arm twisted in 1972 to join the committee and have never managed to find anyone who wanted to take it on after that and are still there. There's nothing wrong with being on something for 50 odd years. It's just that if you do want to step away, And when people want to step away, you need other people who are being a succession strategy so that other people are interested in taking it on. And clearly, the broader your community centre actually is, and the more groups it caters for, and the more it is at the centre of your community, then the more likely it is that you're going to have people who are going to join the committee.
Fantastic. And I'm going to take the questions slightly out of order because I think this one naturally follows on from what you've just saying. Caroline's been asking what would be an ideal sort of size for a core group? What's the best number, I suppose, that works effectively?
Usually between about 6 and 12. Quite a lot of groups which want to be very representative end up having ones that are about 20, and that's a bit unwieldy. You want enough people to get into one room, have a discussion, and be able to come to a conclusion. Having too small a group can feel as if it's a very narrow set of people from a community who are involved, and also can be really difficult if somebody gets ill and just can't attend. So, where you've got groups of 4, you and your quorum, if you need 3 people to get quorum in a meeting and you've only got 4 people on the board, it's a very fine line. So I would say between about 6 and 12, but I don't think there's any hard and fast rule. To some extent, it depends on what works for the organisation themselves. If there are more people who want to get involved, there are loads of ways to do that. And putting forward volunteering opportunities can be great. You can have subcommittees which look at particular things. I worked with a community organisation developing a community centre where they had people who really didn't want to be on the board, but were happy to do meeting and greeting, putting out chairs and this sort of thing. They had another group of young people who wanted to manage their social media for them. So there are lots of ways to get people, hooks to get people involved without them necessarily immediately having to be on the board.
Well, I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because not everybody wants to sit on a board or a committee, and actually, you probably want to keep quite a broad talent pool of enthusiastic volunteers and supporters if you can do.
I think it's a brilliant idea, and it can be really helpful to have that wider pool. And hopefully, in the long term, some of those people, if the board, you have people who want to retire from the board, then you have other people who will take on the mantle because they've got involved and they feel a sense of community and ownership about the building or the land.
Mm-hmm. Just another question. Paul's been waiting patiently. He's just asking, how would it work if you were looking to speak with a diocese rather than a council? Have you any experience of working with sort of churches or religious institutions?
I have done a little bit of this. Clearly, community asset transfer doesn't necessarily apply because they're not a statutory organisation. You would need to look. There's nothing to stop you having a dialogue with anyone, but I guess they're unlikely, perhaps, to want to transfer land or buildings at nil cost. Or at a discount, but they might. And I think it's just, it's about finding out who's involved and starting to get that dialogue going.
Great. Okay. And with just a general comment, it's come through a couple of times, people saying how useful it would be to have these slides available after the webinar. So I know we record these sessions for future use, but I'm hoping we should be able to keep these slides on the hub, the location for all the information for pioneers and pioneer coordinators. It sounds okay to you, doesn't it, Debbie?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think having the slides, and I'll also recommend a publication which you can download at the end. So yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So I'm coming into my last set of slides at the moment. So I've talked quite a bit about the ways in which you as pioneers might work with community organisations around community asset transfer. I'm going to go back now to think about what the council is going to require. So just very quickly, suitable legal structure. They will ask about the board, whether they have the skills to run the property, to manage the land. They will want a business plan and cash flow forecasts. They will ask about policies and procedures. Now, that will be particularly about things like health and safety and also about safeguarding. Some local authorities want a form of quality standard. The other thing which we haven't talked a lot about is evidence of benefits to the local authority, to the local community, and to the applicant. In particular about the local authority. Most local authorities publish a lot of documentation about their 10-year plan, their priorities, what they want to see happen for young people and older people and people with disabilities and people who are seeking jobs and so on. Now, often when you download a policy about community asset transfer, the local authority will tell you what they want you to address when you make your application. And they may often give you links to particular policy documents which you need to read and talk about. In many ways, it's about the group showing that the community asset transfer that they're intending to do will help to deliver some of the objectives that the local council wants to see. Now that sounds quite highfalutin, but it isn't. Almost all community organisations will be doing things which deliver council plans. They won't be getting paid for it in many cases, but they will be doing it. So if you take the example of a community organisation which runs a lunch club for older people, they are potentially addressing issues of social isolation, and we know from a lot of the evidence over the last few years that actually being lonely is worse than smoking for your health. People who are coming along to the lunch club are getting a decent meal. They're getting the opportunity to socialise. They're also meeting people, so that people, for example, may be saying to someone who comes along, "You're not looking very well, why don't you go to the doctors?" So maybe people are actually getting to the doctors earlier. Getting an earlier diagnosis means that they're less ill, preventing people from ending up in residential care and nursing care. All of these things can contribute to the local authority's plans for older people and its plans for their borough. If you think about perhaps a community garden, they may have plans about people being healthier, about improving mental health, and a lot of gardening is shown to improve mental health. It may be an opportunity to make the place look better. The council may have objectives about improving the appearance of particular areas. So it is about looking at what you want to do and how that might deliver. I think what is important to do, though, is to address that in detail and make sure you're really clear about it. Many community organisations will kind of say, we're a registered charity and we do good. That's usually not enough, because everybody else who's applying is saying exactly the same thing. We talked about the values of the local community as a place to meet, place for activities to happen, and so on. The advantage to the applicant is often that it gives a firm base to deliver services from. It gives financial sustainability and gives the community a real stake in the local area. I think it'd be good to talk about council motivations about community asset transfer. Why would they do it? So, in the current climate of austerity, which doesn't seem to have ended from my point of view, um, most councils are keen to continue the community use of community buildings. So maybe keen to transfer community buildings which meet the needs of community and provide services. Very few local councillors or council officers want to be the people who see community buildings close. Councils are quite keen in many cases to build partnerships which help them to meet their local plans. And that's organisations which help them to meet their vision and objectives in general, and where they're able to work with them for plans in their local areas. So this may be about how services can be better delivered, about outreach work and things like that. Councils want to deliver community value. They can't do it all by themselves. They never could, but since since the recession in 2009, councils have had much less funding and much less ability to actually deliver on the ground. And many will work very effectively with community organisations to deliver that kind of community value. One of the reasons why so many councils are looking to community asset transfer at the moment is because they have got repair obligations on their buildings and can't afford to meet those repair obligations. Now, local authority estates have very high theoretical standards for the repair and renewal of buildings. So quite often even a very modest building that's in reasonable condition may have quite a high repair schedule attached to it. If they're able to transfer that building along with the repairing obligations, then the local authority doesn't then have to repair that building, and it also loses the backlog of repairs on it. So that's a strong motivation at a time when local authorities are pushed to be able to repair their buildings. And the recession in 2009 was a real push by local authorities to transfer buildings because they really couldn't afford to continue to pay for the repairs. Finally, I guess, one of the things that many community organisations will say to you as pioneers who are supporting them and working with them, and often say to me, is that councils are really intrusive. Why do they need to know all of this stuff? Why do they need to who's on my board? Why do they need every policy that we've got? Why do they need to see my financial projections? And actually, it's quite positive, really. We started campaigning. Locality was formed by the merger of BASAC, which is the British Association of Settlements and Social Action Centres, and the Development Trust Association. BASAC members had been owning buildings for over 100 years. Many of them are settlements, which were set up in the 19th century. The Development Trust Association started lobbying government in around about 2000 to start to look at community asset transfer, to start to transfer assets into the communities to empower those communities. And one of the things we worked really hard to do was to encourage local authorities to transfer assets and not liabilities. So part of that is actually that local authorities see an obligation to make sure that the organisations that they transfer to are able to actually manage that asset on a long-term basis. It's also a very good argument if the local authority is trying to transfer a building which is in very poor repair, that they should at least carry out basic repairs and refurbishments before it's transferred. And in fact, many local authorities do, when they set up a programme of community asset transfer, have some level of capital to invest to make buildings not necessarily, palatial, but watertight with a decent heating system and remove the asbestos. So, there is councils do work quite hard to make sure that, or most of the ones I come across work quite hard to make sure they don't transfer liabilities. So in summary, it's important to involve your local community. Be clear about the use of the asset. Identify the value to the community of a community asset transfer and make sure that that's communicated effectively. Think through the options. Taking on a building may not be the best option for the group that you're working with, and they need to think about all the options before they decide on one particular course. It is really important to understand the finances of your asset. Being financially sustainable in the long term makes it much easier to manage that asset. It gives peace of mind to those who are involved in managing it. Understand the timescales. And after all of that cautionary tale, I think people should enjoy running their asset. The majority of locality members either own and manage an asset or they have aspirations to do so. Almost all of our members do that really successfully. So I think the message is that if you go into it with your eyes wide open, really look at the options, then owning a building, owning a piece of land can be incredibly positive. There are some resources. The locality website is there. You can download To Have and To Hold, which is a guide to acquiring, refurbishing and managing community buildings. It's not bedtime reading unless you have chronic insomnia, but it is really useful. Dip in and dip out when you need to know something. There is also a short publication about understanding community asset transfer. We also have a publication on choosing a legal structure. The Charity Commission website has quite a lot of information about setting up a charity. So that's quite useful as well if you're working with an unincorporated organisation which is looking at their options for legal structure. And that's sort of me finished. So if I could hand back to you, Steve, and see what other questions we have.
Okay, so we've just had the one question come in, and it's saving the biggest to the last potentially. So Paul's asked, do you envisage that with the cuts to budgets in local councils, that Brexit itself will influence the kind of spaces that can be saved?
I think that's a completely unanswerable question. I mean, I think, I think what we've seen since 2009 is that if council budgets are squeezed, then they will look for transferring. They will look at transferring more and more land and buildings. I think that tends to be land and buildings which are at the lower value end of the spectrum. If you have something which is worth 10 million, then the likelihood is the local authority is actually going to sell it on the open market because they want the 10 million. we've always argued, and hopefully Save Our Spaces will continue to argue, that that shouldn't be the case. It should be based on need and who can make the best use of that building. And in many ways, the Scottish system of reinforcing right to bid gives communities a lot more clout in that. Communities in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland um, have a much weaker version. Sorry, communities in England have a much weaker version of right to bid. So I think it depends on whether local authorities get another round of austerity coming out of Brexit. I think it's really difficult to know without knowing what Brexit is going to be like. And I'm afraid I've broken my crystal ball at the moment. Without knowing what that's going to be like, it's really difficult to see what the implications will be.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And it was a valiant attempt. Who knows what's going to happen? To be honest, there's no other questions have come through at this stage. I just wanted to say a couple of things just as we were drawing this to a close. I mean, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation and for covering the whole concept of the asset transfer so thoroughly. I think that was really interesting and incredibly helpful. One thing I would say to all the pioneers sort of on the webinar is that, these things I would imagine in the kind of work we're doing are going to be the exception rather than the rule. We're asking pioneers, on a very few hours a week, only 16 hours a month to engage with their community, work with our local causes, and to sort of promote the whole concept of endangered spaces and what we're trying to achieve with the campaign. We don't envisage pioneers to be out there looking for an asset transfer in every single one of our communities and then leading the charge over a 3-year period. This is about you being given the tools and the information and I suppose a way of signposting and supporting people to get some answers to their questions, and maybe even to form the questions they didn't know they had to ask in order to at least consider their options about whether a transfer is for them or not. So please don't be daunted by it. But also, I suppose, if somebody's asking the question, you don't need to run away from it either. There's the advisory service that we offer in partnership with Locality. There is this webinar itself and the having to hold document that Debbie's made reference to. And there's also the toolkits that Locality have helped develop with us to sort of help guide people through the decisions you need to make and through the journey they go on to complete an asset transfer. In some communities, this might not come up as an issue, but that's where the pioneer potentially can just draw attention to the whole issue of endangered spaces and the loss of community land and buildings that faces all of our communities. And just raising that awareness might be enough at that time. But at least now you've got an insight into, I suppose, the pinnacle of engagement and activity that might be required in some areas, and an idea of sort of how to point people in the right direction and give them an insight into the kind of conversations they'll need to be having with various stakeholders to actually sort of successfully compete in asset transfer if that's what they ultimately deem is required. So on that basis, Debbie, oh sorry, something else has just popped in. Oh yeah, so just a big thank you from Anne, just saying a really interesting presentation. So thanks again, Debbie, for everything you've said tonight.
Thanks to everyone. I mean, obviously there is the advice line. Please do use it. It's there to be used. No question is too small or or off kilter. Just ask. We're very happy to do it, and I do think from what you've just said, Steve, that pioneers are in such a good position to be really supportive, but also slightly on the outside of many of the groups, which are looking at ideas about land and buildings, to help people think about their options and to be able to pose those kinds of questions. So, I do think this I'm really great that people have been able to join and listen. And if we can be of any help, please do get in touch.
Okay, thank you everyone, and that's us for this evening.
That's brilliant. And I'm going to try and work out how to stop the webinar.